Hello, this is Mrs. Brown, and today we're going to look at what's a monomial. Okay, so I start with the definition, and then we'll look at some examples and non-examples to make it easier to understand. A monomial is a number, variable, or product of a number and one or more variables with non-negative integer exponents. That's a lot of information. Okay, so we've got numbers, we've got variables or a product like 3x or 3t. And non-negative integer exponents. So for instance, x to the third power, x to the fourth power would be totally fine. You couldn't do x to the half or x to the -2. Those wouldn't work. Non-negative, so not negative, and it has to be an integer, so no fractions or decimals. And it also only has one term. So terms are separated by addition and subtraction signs. So we'll look at some in the non-examples, what that looks like. And so for a monomial, you're checking to see that it's got positive integer exponents, that it is a one-term expression. And as I said, as we look at some examples, it's going to make a lot more sense. All right, so for instance, 3x squared is an example of a monomial, or the number 5. It's a monomial. It's all by itself. 8, a to the 4th, b to the 8th, c is also a monomial because even though there's a bunch of variables, all of these have exponents. Remember, if it's just c, that's the same as c to the 1st. We just don't usually write the 1. These are all non-negative integer exponents, and it's the product of one or more variables and a number. So that's totally fine. Even something like w squared divided by 12 to the third power would be an example of a monomial because, again, none of the exponents have negative, are negative. They're all positive exponents, okay? I could also include something like -2m to the third. It's okay for -2 to, as the coefficient to be negative. It just can't be the exponent that's negative. Okay, so let's look at some non-examples. 8a squared divided by b. So with b in the denominator, that's actually equivalent to a negative exponent. So that's equal to 8a squared b to the -1. And if you remember from your notes yesterday, I showed you that as part of your notes. We'll be doing more practice with that this week. So looking at that, this is a non-example because this counts as a -1 if I were to write it this way. So this doesn't count. So if you're dividing by a variable, not going to work. 9c squared d to the -1. Again, that negative exponent, it's not a monomial. If I have something like 8x plus 7, this has two terms because it's separated by an addition sign. This is a term and this is a term, so it's not. The same thing if I had something like 9m minus 3n. Again, two terms because it's separated by a subtraction sign, so it's not going to count. Okay? Now, there are three types of monomials that you may run into in terms of your assignment, the vocabulary. So let's just take a quick moment to look at that. You should already know the word constant, and that is a real number. And those are things like the number 5, 1/2, -3.7. Those are all things that are examples of a constant. It's just a regular real number. And yes, imaginary numbers do exist, but that's not the subject of today. Linear expression is another term you might run into. And a linear expression is just the variable has an exponent of 1. Okay, and so if we're looking at an example of that, something like 4m, because even though we don't write the 1, that's the same as 4m to the first power. The letter r all by itself, or 2 times y. Again, all of these have an exponent of 1 because we don't list it. And so that would be an example. And then the last one, and by the way, linear is a fancy word for has line in it, so it's in a straight line. Whereas if we have non-linear, these are things that might involve curves. And so that is why we differentiate between those. Most of what you've been dealing with are things that are linear, that are in straight lines, like with the systems that we've been dealing with. You've been dealing with linear equations, things that are in a straight line. So now we're working on a little bit of things that are non-linear. And so the variable has an exponent greater than 1. Okay, and so examples would be x to the third power, 2m squared, 4r to the fifth power, any of those, because they're not linear. They're not in a straight line. It would have to be to the first power if it was going to be linear. Okay, that's the overview of the vocabulary for this lesson. If you have any questions, you know where to find me, and have a great day.